Hello everyone, this is Masako Ganaha. Today I have a wonderful guest who is right now in United States. And let me introduce him. My guest is Alfred Johnson. He is a private detective in real world, and also he belongs to Historical Detective Agency. Thank you very much for taking time.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here and spending time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Last year, I recall we did live stream, and you talked us about how we have to be aware of the when we using internet or technology, they are watching us, even if we think
Always.
we are engaging it. So it was very educational talk. And so today we are going to talk about road to war. So we are going to dig into the history between United States and Japan. And so you have doing this research recently and find out that something that we have to learn for American people and as Japanese, and in order to prepare what's coming or to protect us. So first of all, could you please introduce us, Al? Because the last live stream we did on YouTube somehow went somewhere. I cannot find it. So maybe it was too, what should I say, politically incorrect, which is good for the world.
Could be. We'll blame the bad guys. There we go. Um, but yeah, my name is Alfred Johnson or Al Johnson. And currently I'm a private investigator with Secure Point Investigations. But I also am part of the Historical Detective Agency, which is a group of investigators, military analysts, historical analysts, researchers, and some traditional historians that kind of get together and take what we call an evidence-based approach to history, meaning that we use the same skill sets and the same mindset as a detective would in looking at history. And it's an evidence-based approach, which is different than, say, an academic-based approach. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it allows us to kind of get a unique or fresh view on history because we're simply following the facts. We're not trying to go for political outcome, or we're not trying to go for economic gain, like it's something everybody's going to be interested in. We just want answers, right? We want to find the truth, right? And I think in Japanese, what is it? Shinjitsu wa soko ni aru, right? The truth is out there, and we want to find it. And so that's what we do. And so prior to becoming a private investigator, I worked with various groups, both in the military, U.S. military. I was there for 13 years. And part of that, we looked at network targeting, so the terrorist networks. And we began to investigate them, everything from post-blast. I was an EOD officer for a while, and then started to get into the counter ID network, and then the terrorist groups. And eventually that led to trying to figure out what radicalized them. In other words, what kind of mindset you have to actually go out and now either kill yourself, blowing up a bomb, or try to kill other people to do that. And so that kind of led over the last 20 years to some very interesting avenues. And then, as you know, we worked with tracking kind of information wars that were going, between nations, and kind of we call it history wars, because a lot of history was used for political shaping and social manipulation of different groups to get different outcomes, sometimes including violence. So we really, really focus on, okay, what's the truth of those things so that we can counter, misinformation campaigns that are out there. And for me, it's very important to have the truth, because if you base all your solutions on a lie or on something that's not true, you're never going to solve the problem, right? You're never going to come to a realistic solution, because all the information you're operating on isn't true. It isn't factual. So the more we can be accurate in how we see history, the better I think we're able to apply solutions today and in the future. So that's a little bit of my background. And that's why I'm here. And then this project that we're doing is actually through the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. You met him before, Colonel Sarga Sangari. I think he was on your show, or you're on his show. But he runs a kind of a think tank, and they wanted to know the basic question was, where are we right now? So the U.S. and China, as you know, there's a lot of tension going on. There's a lot of tension between, China and Japan, and China and all of their neighbors, right? Because they're kind of growing, they're expanding, they're very militaristic. Basically, it's a militaristic dictatorship that's expanding. And so what his question to us was, let's look at history, because a lot of Americans, rightly or wrongly, look at a parallel between what Japan was in the early 20th century and where China is now. And the question that he wanted was, where is the United States today versus where we were with Japan as far as preparedness, right? So if China suddenly attacks Taiwan or Okinawa or Hawaii, is America prepared for it? And how does this kind of compare to back in the 1940s and 30s, and how could we react quick enough to be able to respond to the Chinese threat of sudden aggression? And what happened was it actually kind of surprised us, because all of the assumptions that we had about what had occurred were not supported by the facts. The evidence that we came up with didn't support the facts about what people thought in this country and many places all over the world, what occurred prior to Pearl Harbor, what kind of led to Pearl Harbor, and where America was in being prepared for a war with Japan. It kind of shocked us. And that's pretty much what we'll talk about today, is the results of those findings. And to me, they're pretty good lessons learned for both the Americans and Japanese. For the Americans, having been former military and prepared a lot for, deployments and operations, you always want to be as prepared and as trained as you can. You can never have too much training, never, right? But having seen what this interwar period was to prepare America prepared for war with Japan, it was very robust. It was amazingly planned, and it was very much, they were very professional about what they did, the American military. And then looking today at preparations for a potential conflict with China, I don't see it. It's not there. And the people we talked to that, we gave these results to, it's not there. And so that's kind of frightening for Americans. We are woefully unprepared. For Japan, it's a good lesson because, as you'll see in the presentation, sometimes if a nation gets ready for war, there's really nothing you can do to avoid it, right? There's very little you can do other than just surrender right away to avoid a conflict. And that sometimes you don't realize it, but the adversary is training very, very hard at beating you, right? And he may have done it for generations. And so we have to be ready for China to have done kind of what America did back in the 1910s and 20s and 30s against Japan in preparing for a conflict. And, are we ready for it? And if America is not ready for it, can Japan kind of handle it on their own? So, but anyway, we'll talk about that as we go. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you very much. So this presentation that you're going to give us, the research started from a question from American people's point of view that as American, are they ready for whatever happens from CCP aggressiveness? And the research is started. It's very interesting for us Japanese. We have this myth that whatever happens to Taiwan or where I am from, Okinawa, American people will help us. That's our myth. And I'm trying to make many Japanese people up, and I hope your presentation, I'm sure, will shockingly open Japanese people's eyes. So could you please start the presentation? And now I'm going to give you the make presenter, so you can use you can show us your materials. Now you are presenter.
Okay. Could you are you able to see the screen right now?
Right now I see you.
Okay. let me let me share the screen here real quick.
Okay.
Here we go. Be just one moment. How about now? Can you see it?
Yes, I do.
Perfect. Again, so this is the group that one of the groups I belong to, which is the Historical Detective Agency. Like I said, we use basically an evidence-based approach to come at problems. Most of what you'll read is either an academic-based approach, or people, normal historians have an academic-based approach, and that's unfortunately it has a lot of bias within it. So because they're wanting to move the evidence into their thesis or into their answer, right? They already have an answer and they're trying to support their argument. We don't have an argument. We just follow the evidence and say, here's what we have. And that's the difference, is that we have an evidence-based approach and we can follow the evidence wherever it leads. Academic-based approach, they want a certain answer. They want to sell a book, right, to a certain audience. They want the professors or the college to, sign off on their papers and that sort of thing. And so that's why it's a little bit different in how we go about things. And you'll notice that we, in the findings that we have, sometimes they're shocking because they go against a lot of what the academic-based approach has had over the decades that does it. But I believe you get more realistic, more accurate answers by doing it through our approach. And again, I've already talked about this through the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement, and then that's my real world company is Secure Point Investigations. We do real world investigations based in Washington State, but we kind of operate both the United States and going out. Now, these are the kind of the findings. So we wanted to look at, when did the U.S. first begin to mobilize for a war with Japan? And the conventional wisdom is it was either, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II started in Europe, that's when America began to slowly mobilize. That's kind of the conventional wisdom. And then was there any early warning that could have been used to feed into mobilization? Did we miss that? And then who was responsible for those failures, and where could they have been fixed? But what we found was the U.S. began to mobilize, well before Pearl Harbor, and in some cases, well before the war in Europe had broken out. Was there early warning? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the United States had anticipated an attack decades prior to 1941 of an attack on Pearl Harbor. And you'll see that we had actually planned it. We knew it could happen. We knew Pearl Harbor was vulnerable. We had game played it, and it was in the plans, and it was public knowledge. Actually, we'll show that here in a few minutes. And then based on that, there was actually no failure. Everything went pretty much according to plan. Which was the shocking part, right? We had trained for it. It was in the plans. There really wasn't a failure because we knew that there would be a surprise attack, probably on Hawaii, and that would begin the war. And so we were prepared for it. We were planned for it. So it really wasn't a failure. It was according to plan. So that was a big surprise. And then as we kept digging, we kept going into the source documents. We kept looking at some really good research that came out lately. We kept having more surprises. And so for the Japanese, I'm not sure. Some Japanese, I believe, have these same kind of ideas about history. And the U.S. definitely does. In fact, you actually run into arguments with Americans if you kind of go against this. It's become a religion, unfortunately. World War II in America for certain groups of people is a religion. And if you debate on facts or you present new facts, they argue with you as if they're arguing against, as if you were attacking their religion. So it's very contentious. But this is kind of what most Americans believe, and it's the kind of what we call the conventional narrative, that after the First World War, America kind of retreated back into isolationism, and because of that, the military was not prepared, and that we were woefully unprepared. We were asleep between the wars, and then the rise of Japan, and then the attack on Pearl Harbor. Was a surprise attack. And sometimes you'll hear variations that, yeah, we knew the Japanese were going to attack, but we didn't know it was Pearl Harbor. We thought it was only going to be in the Philippines or Southeast Asia. So we had no idea that it would be in Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. If people bring up the economic blockade or the economic sanctions that America had against Japan, they say, well, we were doing it because since 1937, Japan had, they were at war with China, and that's why we were doing it. We were defending China, or we were responding to the Japanese aggression in China, and that's why we had this economic policy. However, what we found out was pretty much the opposite. That America had continued foreign engagement and military buildup after World War I. We didn't stop. We continued to build up on the Navy side. The Army side, not so much, but that was by design. It wasn't by negligence. It was by very calculated planning, because the Navy required, if you lay down a ship, that requires a lot of investment, right? So you have to really build this thing up, and it needs to last about 20, 30 years. And it may take 5 years or 10 years for a ship to be fully ready to go, right? Seaworthy, depending on the complexity. And so the Navy needed that. The Navy was also the front line were the first line of defense for America. It was a primary defense because of the oceans, right, between us and our adversary, Japan, and a future adversary in Europe. We relied on the Navy to defend us. So yes, the Army was not prepared, but you can mobilize an army and give them tanks and guns within a year, right? It's very easy to do that compared to trying to get an aircraft carrier in the water and training everybody on it and putting putting aircraft on it. So that was by design. America didn't stop. We kept going and developing the Navy and modernizing it and funding it after World War I. So we were very prepared with the Navy in World War II, especially in the plans and the equipment, how it was designed for the Navy, the Marines, and that sort of thing. We knew Pearl Harbor was a viable target as early as the 1920s, and we'll go into that here. So it was never really a surprise attack that we were surprised. It was in our plans that we knew that if we had assets in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese would attack them. And the U.S. was not adversarial to Japan in 1937. It didn't start then. The U.S. began its adversarial relationship with Japan in 1907, 30 years before the Second Sino-Japanese War that everybody tends to point to in history books, saying, well, this is the reason for it, that America began to look at Japan as an enemy. And the facts don't support that. The facts actually show 1907, we began to kind of put the target on Japan and say, okay, this is our next adversary. And then in some groups that you'll see, it was actually 1895 among some very influential people. They began to look at Japan as a peer competitor and as an enemy. So we call it Case File 003. It was the road to war. And Ronald Spector had actually written this. It's a pretty famous book, Eagle Against the Sun. He wrote it in 1985, and he didn't even have all the information that we did. And he basically said what we found out, which was few wars in American history have been so long anticipated or so long planned for. So even with the information he had, which is about a third of what we found in 1985, he could even see that, yeah, this was a pretty planned war. We were really ready for it. The myth that America had gone back into isolationism after World War I, the First World War, is basically borne out by the budget. So look at the Navy budget, and then this coincides to World War I here. So of course you're going to have this big jump, but the war's over for the United States in 1918. We're demobilizing by 1919, but if you'll notice, the budget continued. This is actually an arms race. After World War I, we were already in an arms race with Japan for battleships, right? So the large kind of capital ships, which defined kind of a nation's strength in those days, was naval power. And the battleship race between the U.S. and Japan was occurring after World War I until the Washington Naval Arms Treaty restricted, large ships. However, the United States never ever retreated back down. We always maintained about twice to three times the budget of our pre-war naval budget. So see, we didn't stop and go back into isolationism with regards to the military. The military was always still forward deployed. We were still in China. We were still in South America. We were still doing operations in Central and South America, and in the United Nations, the League of Nations, which was before the United Nations. So the League of Nations that was formed afterward, we did not join it. However, we were very involved in League of Nations programs, such as the anti-malarial campaign, the anti-opium campaign, the anti-white slavery trafficking, and the Americans would actually fund, not directly to the League of Nations, but they would be able to support around it and give secondary support, so that many nations that were in the League of Nations would say, well, is America going to support it? And if they do, then we'll vote for it. So America was very involved in it. We actually renegotiated the finances of Germany, defeated Germany in the 1920s. We were the lead on that, which shaped Europe and actually probably led to the rise of Hitler, or contributed to the rise of Hitler, when we restructured the German debt and required them to pay it in a certain way. So we were very much involved in a lot of diplomatic efforts. We were very much involved in overseas military campaigns, small kind of campaigns in Haiti, South America, Central America, China, and we continued to build up. And here's the other part that's interesting: is in 1933, we began, continually raising the military budget for the Navy. We actually started it a little earlier, 1929 to 1931. We authorized more shipbuilding, brand new ships, and that continued. And the naval shipyards in 1933, what this chart doesn't show is that naval shipyards began to increase so that by the time the war hit, we had hundreds of naval shipyards ready to go down from a handful, in the 1930s. So our mobilization actually arguably began in the 1930s. We began the mobilization well before 1937, which is the Second Sino-Japanese War. So we knew what was going to happen. We began that trajectory. So that's kind of by the numbers, demonstrating that some of those myths that we have are false. This is the road to war. This is kind of the timeline. As I said before, in 1907, just after the Russo-Japanese War, 1905, America looked at Japan, and Teddy Roosevelt actually went to the War Department and said, "Do you have a plan to go to war with Japan?" And they said, "No, sir, we don't. But the next year, but we'll get back to you." And so, in about a year, they made War Plan Orange, which was a very, very detailed plan against Japan. It evolved into a 3-phase operation, which was to allow Japan to come into our waters or our defensive area, attack us, and then over time we would do defensive operations. Then we would begin to aggress to Japan, economically blockade Japan, and then phase 3 is reduce Japan completely, right? Either by bombardment, and later when we started getting aircraft carriers, by aviation and sea bombardment. So this was a plan that was put in place very early, and the plan was worked every year. There's some major updates, but every year they're working on the plan. And then starting in 1923, America started full-scale naval exercises, and sometimes with the Army involved, the Marines involved, with home defense units in Hawaii and the Philippines and Panama, in training on that plan for the fleet. We call them fleet problems. But this was massive full-scale exercises on that plan, and then the lessons learned would kind of get thrown back in there. So, and again, 1923, that's almost 20 years prior to Pearl Harbor. We're looking at almost 2 decades before that, and a decade before Japan was even in Manchuria. So this kind of lays the timeline that yes, that we were very prepared and very focused on it. I have not found been no other plans like this for any other country, to include the Soviet Union, which is crazy. This is from the United States, the Department of the Army, Office of Chief of Military History in 1959. It's called Command Decisions, and basically they lay out that every conceivable situation involving the United States in a war with Japan, including a surprise air attack on Pearl Harbor, was carefully considered and appropriate defense measures were adopted. And it closes by saying, "Rarely have war plans been so comprehensive and detailed, so complete at every echelon, and so long in preparation." So remember, we had the plan in 1908, and we worked it all the way to 1941. So including Pearl Harbor and all sorts of other contingency plans. In 1935, we started working on seeing Germany added to it. So Germany and Japan. I believe it was 1936, 37, we said, correctly anticipated Italy would join in that. Italy didn't join in until 1940. Japan didn't join in until about 1940. So we correctly anticipated a lot of the things that were going to happen. The Army planners actually knew in 1911, they correctly anticipated Japan would have to take over Manchuria, right? They just knew when China was falling apart in 1911, or the Manchurian Empire was falling apart in 1911, the American war planners in the Army War College correctly assessed that the political and economic pressures would force Japan to be able to take Manchuria. And that's exactly what happened, but it didn't happen until 1931, 1932. But the Army forecast that and put it in their assumptions in 1911. So what were the fleet problems? These things were massive. I'm kind of jealous as a military person because we never got enough. I felt we never got enough to train, right? You can never train enough. I never felt when I was in the military we had enough budget, enough time, and I hated it when we would have to what we call notionalize or do things in a shortcut. These guys between the wars, the U.S. Navy, if on the plan they were sailing, thousands of miles between Hawaii and Tokyo on the war plan, they would find the same distance and geography in South America or the Caribbean, and they would sail the actual distance during the training. So they actually got to test the equipment under as realistic conditions as possible. So the men, the equipment, and the doctrine were trained to the breaking point every single year for almost 20 years. So by the time the war hit, it was amazingly prepared for. And these were free maneuvers. So they had a half of the Navy would pretend to be the Japanese, the other half of the Navy would pretend to be the Americans, and they would fight it out. every year. And sometimes they would have month-long engagements or 2-month-long training where they just fought each other. One group pretending they're the Japanese, the other group pretending the Americans, and they were practicing against the plan. And then they would take that and they would feed it back into the training, and they would repeat it every year. So this was actually a year-long process. So the Army and Navy war colleges were completely focused on what we call the spade work. So they would do things like figure out how fast and how far the Japanese planes can fly, how fast the Japanese ships are, what were they made of, what are the guns ranges. So all throughout the year, they're working on these things. And then they would put that into the war plan for that year, or the exercise plan. Throughout the year, the individual ships, sailors, and smaller groups within the fleet, for example, like submarine group or aviation group, would do smaller drills and smaller exercises to prepare for this big one that happens every year. And then they would do the big fleet problem, and then the lessons learned from the fleet problem, which sometimes lasted 2 months or more, with everybody pretty much fighting that plan. Then those results would go back into a couple things. One is equipment and design, because if you're breaking the equipment, it doesn't, your submarines can't keep up with your aircraft carriers. Okay, we need faster submarines, right? The destroyers can't do shore bombardment and air screening and anti-submarine. So we need one destroyer that can do everything, right? Okay, let's design it, let's do it, and budgeting. So they worked that into equipment, manpower, and planning, and then it would start all over again every year. And they just kept doing it for over 20 years. So if you were a young ensign or lieutenant JG in the Navy starting out in 1920, you would work this every single year, and by the time World War II hit, you're an admiral. So you've done nothing except your entire career except training for war with Japan. So our admirals basically have been training to fight war with Japan since they got in the Navy, basically. So it really was an amazing system as far as how that works. So it was kind of surprising. I'm going to show one thing here real quick. So if anybody's interested in some of the timeline of it, you can actually go to the website, and there's 2 sites to it. So kind of our main websites here, you go to Historical Detective Agency, but you go to case files, and we have 2 of them. One of them's kind of a summary where you go through, and then the second one is the timeline itself, just year by year. Kind of what was going on. And so in some cases, you can actually look before the war or before 1907 and see that there was tension already occurring between America and Japan. So that was kind of the interesting part about this whole thing. So let me stop this and we'll go back over to here. So the other thing that I wanted to kind of show was it wasn't just the Navy guys. So during these fleet exercises, there were congressmen, U.S. congressmen, sometimes the President Roosevelt was on actually observing one of these fleet exercises, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. The executive level was very involved in this, including the press. The press was there. So you had Congress, you had the press, you had your politicians watching these fleet exercises, and then the Navy guys could talk directly to them and, hey, we need budget for this, we need budget for this, and that would feed back into it. So it wasn't like a really, really secret thing. It was kind of out there. And so much so there's a guy, and this is the other thing that was very interesting. There was a guy called Hector Bywater. I'm not sure if the Japanese know who Tom Clancy is, but in America, if you mention Tom Clancy to the Navy or military or government, they know who he is. And he was a really good military analyst that wrote, fiction, but the fiction was about a realistic kind of projection based upon the knowledge of the military, of yourself and the adversary, kind of a what if, right? And a realistic what if, not like a fantasy what if. So back in the 1920s, there was a guy named Hector Bywater, and he had been a British spy, but he knew the naval science. And so he was able to analyze very effectively naval capability. And he analyzed the Japanese naval capability. He analyzed American naval capability. He knew about War Plan Orange because, they actually put it in the newspapers. So he knew War Plan Orange is out there. He knew fleet exercises. And what he did was very early on in the 1923-24, he wrote a book called The Great Pacific War. And so this is 1925. I think this one was published 1925. And it was a theoretical war between America and Japan. What would happen, right? So, and he was actually saying that at that time, based on the equipment that we would probably have in 10 years, so about 1930 to 31, and that's when he fictionally put this war was 1931 between America and Japan when he wrote this in 1920s. It was just bloody. It was going to be high casualties. We had just gotten done with World War I. He says the Pacific was going to be similar. It's going to be, pretty bloody, pretty brutal, and for what? So it was actually kind of an anti-war. He was actually dissuading the Americans, saying, why are you doing this? It's not going to be very beneficial. But in the book itself, he has this surprise attack from the north coming into Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese coming north of Pearl Harbor on a Sunday, attacking Pearl Harbor by air, right? So it was already there. Every admiral, captain, down to Lieutenant JG, everybody was reading this book. It was a bestseller among the military, right? So they knew and they saw that's how the war started, was the Japanese could sneak up and do a sneak attack at the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. And that was 1920s, right? So 1923, he's reading it. The other interesting part was there was a Japanese that actually read this book, and his name was, at the time, it was Captain Isoroku Yamamoto, right? When he was a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., this was the book that was very, very popular when he was there. And, he notices that all the American Navy guys that he's talking to and going to dinner with, they're reading this book. So he read the book, and he wrote a paper about this book and sent it back through the diplomatic papers, and it's in the diplomatic records in Tokyo, that he wrote about this book. So the idea about Pearl Harbor may have come to Yamamoto from this book. You see, in other words, how am I going to do it? And he writes about it. Now, they didn't have the torpedo bombings and all that, so he has a lot of technical things he still has to work out. But the basic idea about doing that sneak attack to the north and coming in may have come from this book. He definitely read it, and he definitely used the same tactics later on in December 7th, 1941. So that's a possibility. We have to look more. He did meet the author when he was in London. He met the author of this book, Hector Bywater. So Yamamoto and the author met each other in 1931, and they did talk for hours. So, it's kind of interesting about, where did the idea about the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor came from? It may have come from a British guy that was trying to actually deter a war between America and Japan. So that's another interesting part of it. If people are interested in more details, some of the focus on Japan. The other part I want to emphasize is that the population itself, the American population, had been at certain times, well before 1937, focused on Japan as an enemy, and a lot of it came from what we found was kind of racist policies in California. There was a lot of anti-Japanese movements in California that wanted to get Japanese out. There was talk of putting Japanese in concentration camps and then kicking them out, and this was well before 1941. So the relocation camps that occurred in 1941, 1942 with FDR, they actually talked about that well before FDR became president. So there were people discussing doing that to Japanese before war, just getting them out of California. They were segregating them in schools and all that sort of thing. So there was already an animosity with certain groups of Americans against the Japanese based on immigration policy and based on certain things that were happening mostly in California. And the other issue is that you'll see, and I'll show you some of the newspaper articles here, the source documents. In 1907, and again in 1913, there was a war scare between America and Japan. The newspapers were all about, we're going to go to war with Japan. In 1907, so just 2 years after the Russo-Japanese War, a lot of Americans were scared because that war was very, very upsetting to a lot of people in the West, right? So a lot of people had seen a non-white, non-Christian nation defeat a white Christian nation. And that shouldn't be, right? It was reversing their view of the world, right? And it was frightening. So a lot of Americans suddenly panicked and think, well, we're next. The Japanese are going to come here. And so in the newspapers, you'll see a lot of newspaper articles that are inflaming this war scare between America and Japan. And in fact, there was even there was a guy, his name was Schwab, not the WEF Schwab that you met in Davos, no relation, but he's an American. He's very, very rich. He's kind of like the Bill Gates, back in the 1910s. And he actually said it's kind of like, he said that if the U.S. doesn't buy battleships, they call them dreadnoughts, if the U.S. doesn't buy these battleships to be ready to fight Japan, I'll buy them. And he's a millionaire, right? Billionaire at the time. I'll buy them. So it's like Elon Musk saying, unless you go to war with this country, unless the military buys it, I'll buy it myself and then give it to you. So, I mean, that was the level of kind of animosity some people had toward Japan. And toward that, there's actually another good book here that most people don't know about. So the propaganda continued through, even in Versailles. So Japan was an ally of America during World War I, right? So they were with the Entente, they were with the British, the French, and the Americans, right, in World War I. So they were allies. And then at the end of the war, we went to Versailles. We were doing the Versailles Treaty and forming the League of Nations. Even though the U.S. didn't join it, we were forming it. It was our idea. And during that time, you're our ally, right? Supposedly. Well, guess what? This was actually written by an American, and it was pushed out in the Treaty of Versailles. This is a huge propaganda book, an amazing propaganda book, basically saying Japan is going to take over the world, and we need to go to war with Japan. We need to tell them, get out of here. Literally. I mean, he gave this was distributed to all of the diplomats and everyone at the Versailles conference. So you're the ally, and there's this massive propaganda book that was written by a former U.S. diplomat, and he was literally writing about, Japan is evil, Japan's going to take over the world, and we need to be ready for it. And this is a copy of that book that went out. Let me see how many pages it is here. It's pretty substantial. I mean, you're looking at about 300 pages of it. It's The Problem of Japan. So we were already, focused, even as you're our friend, we're like, hey, there are groups in America that's like, we need to kind of go in there and set our sights on Japan. So there's one thing. And did that continue beyond? And it may have been in response. I mean, part of it also, remember Japan in the Treaty of Versailles, you wanted to put the universal recognition of religion and the universal recognition of race, the equality of religion and equality of race within the League of Nations Charter. And remember, it was the U.S. that pressured the other nations, Britain and France, to say no, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, Wilson Colonel House was actually pushing it, but Wilson was the front man, and he was saying, hey, there's 21 points, self-determination. And then Japan comes in and says, well, all religions are equal, all races are equal. And America's like, no. And that's a threat. And in those days, that was a threat to the United States worldview. We don't like to say it. We like to think of ourselves as not racist at that time, but we very much were. And for a nation to do that was a threat to kind of the world order that we saw. So here's another evidence piece of agitation of some groups to keep animosity between Japan and America at that time. Later on in the 1910s, 1920s, this was another book that was actually pretty good, so another reprint. But this one was, I believe, 1909. So remember, there was the war scare, 1907, big push, and it's The Valor of Ignorance. And it basically was promoting, it's a big book, promoting war with Japan. So this is an American book saying we need to go to war with Japan. And he goes into, if we don't, then we're going to be conquered and all this sort of thing. And look what they've done in Hawaii. And he's not like Hector Bywater. He's a little fantastical in what he thinks is going to happen. So he kind of has the some things that couldn't happen militarily. They're kind of fantastical, like the Japanese invade California. It's like they didn't have the technology, they couldn't do it. But he has it in here. It's not going to happen. But again, this may have been more propaganda to again push the U.S. to be afraid of Japan and fear Japan. And he was home released, so he was actually a former military guy. But he basically, this is 1909. He's pushing. We need to go to war with Japan. But Japan had not invaded. You hadn't done the Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War. You hadn't gone in Manchuria yet. So, what was the cause? So sometimes what we say is the reason isn't the reason. It's just, this is what's going to happen. And there's a lot of other kind of documents and books and source documents that go into it. But that's the basis of it, is that the United States, between the war, was engaged in the world, very much so. They were diplomatically engaged in things. We were continually working on maintaining and increasing the U.S. Navy. It never went to levels that was below World War I, and that we had planned our next war, right? We knew we're going to go to war with Japan. We don't know when, but we know we're going to go to war with Japan. And we have a very, very, very detailed plan for that war that we're going to be able to go into. And then we train on that plan every single year starting in 1923, and not a little bit. Everybody's going to train on this plan. And it was huge. And every year, all year long, that's what we're doing. We're just keep training and keep doing the cycles, and our equipment that we had ready for Japan had been basically planned, purchased, and began building well before. So when we were laying hulls down, I think in 1930s, the early 1930s, of almost 90% of what equipment we ended up using by 1943 had been in some ways either laid down or budgeted or planned before the war, right? And now it's ready, right? If we started after World War, if we started planning and laying hulls and doing things shipwise in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, they wouldn't have been ready till 1945, 46. So, that was the preparation came before. So it was a very professional interwar military, and they trained a lot. They planned very well. They were very intelligent. They knew the politics, and they were very, very good at projecting which way things are going to go. So they knew Japan would have to go to Manchuria and take it over. They knew that in 1911. Japan didn't do that till 1932. They knew that Japan and Germany would kind of link together. They knew that in 1935. That didn't occur until 1940. They knew that Italy would come into that axis as well. Italy had been an ally, right? And they were still with Britain. They knew that in 1936. That didn't happen until 1940, right? And it was a maybe thing. Mussolini was like, he wasn't sure if he was going to join the Axis or not. So these planners were very good. The War Plan Orange, almost exactly mirrors the way the war occurred in the Pacific. Almost exactly, right? It was ridiculously accurate. The only difference is the technology. So, for example, nobody could know before the war there was an atomic bomb, right? But we knew we had to absolutely level Japan, right? They knew that it was paper. They knew they could start fires, but they didn't have incendiary bombs. But they thought different ways that they could start fires in Japan to burn it out. There was going to be an economic blockade from the very beginning in 1908. In fact, you got one more time, I'll show you this document about the level of planning. So I'm going to share one more time here. And so if we go down here to the actual war plan, so this is an assessment right here. So this is War Plan Orange, and this one is 1907, but it's based on all the intelligence that they had gotten in 1906. So they kind of started it in September 1906. That's when President Teddy Roosevelt came to the War Department and said, do you have a plan against the Japanese? And they said, no, but we'll get back to you, right? So here you go. So they started this assessment for the war plan. So you analyze the enemy, and then you make your plans against the enemy. So this is the initial analysis of Japan, so that we can now make a plan to destroy Japan. And so it goes through very, very detailed. And you'll notice something interesting, and this is important, is that the U.S. from the very beginning was focused on the economics. We knew that Japan was very, very vulnerable in economics, like the supply that Japan got of foodstuff, they got of minerals, they got of oil. And so that was seen as a weakness. And so that was what needed to be exploited. So you'll see in here, and the link is on the website if people are interested in it. But they knew, fairly accurate what Japan's foodstuff was. We got to stop the food. We have to stop the oil. Where do we interdict it? Where does the Japanese get it from? Right. So what can we tell? Like which countries can we pressure to say stop feeding Japan, and which ones do we have to go in and do a physical blockade of? So they're already looking at this about where these things come from. And keep in mind, at this time, Japan and Britain are still friends. You have an alliance, right? Because Britain, remember, supported Japan a lot with finances in the Russo-Japanese War. And with intelligence and things like that. So this was Japan and Britain were still big friends at this time, and the U.S. is still going to go to war with Japan. So it's kind of interesting. So this kind of detail back in those days, this is just the planning about Japan. and where they need to interdict those things is already part of this program. And it goes on for, many pages. And this is just the first draft. This isn't the final draft. This is the basic, first draft. And then, how much coal, because we weren't in oil yet, how much coal is needed, to sail, which distance and give us which speed. So they're beginning to look at our weapons and say, okay, how do we sail across the Pacific to go to Japan, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of interesting to me is that this level of detail that they were getting into is something that in America we didn't know about, because we thought, we were asleep. That's what they tell us. We were asleep, before and after World War I, and Pearl Harbor woke us up. No, we were awake, right? We were trained, we were ready to go. So that's kind of interesting. For me, it was very interesting. The other thing I'll show you here is the planning for the Marines, and this was a guy, Major Ellis, and he in the 1920s, early 1920s, so about 1921, 22, 23, he went through the islands in the Pacific. So Japan in World War I had sided with the Entente, so with Britain and France, and they attacked Germany, and they took over the German colonies in Asia, including what we call the Mandated Islands. So these islands in the Pacific, Japan took them over from Germany. And America almost went to war with that. They actually were thinking about, we will not let you hold those islands. We need those islands, right? So because we had captured Hawaii in I think 1890s, and so we didn't want Japan coming into our lake. We saw the Pacific as ours. Even though Australia had actually done the same thing, so Australia grabbed more islands than Japan did, but we didn't say anything about Australia. It was just Japan. So, but it was real. We realized that actually that helps us because we had no way to sail all the way across the ocean. If some other nation has those islands, it was more difficult for us to get to Japan and fight Japan. So if Japan had these islands, it actually helps us because now we can kind of leapfrog on these islands as stepping stones to get to Japan. So it actually worked out in our favor. So that's when we kind of said, okay, let the Japanese have those islands. They just can't fortify it. And that's in the League of Nations and the settlement. That was part of the conditions, is you can't fortify the Pacific. We said it was for peace. We want to maintain peace, but in reality, we had already worked out that this is, if you guys have those islands, it provides us stepping stones. So we didn't want the islands fortified because we needed those islands to get to Japan, but we had to have Japan own those islands. So when we declared war, we can use those, and we don't have to worry about they're owned by Australia or they're owned by some other country. But what he did, so that was the idea, and what he did was he actually went on every one of those islands. In fact, he died on one of them from, I think, alcohol poisoning. But he developed something called Operation Plan 712, and this was in the 1920s. He was like, "This is how we are going to jump on every island." And this is where we're going to land, and this is where we're going to have to go up. So he walked it. He knew the beaches. He knew how deep the bays were. He knew the terrain, the geography, and then he was working out how do we invade them. And then he kept doing that and kept doing that. But then he died in 1923. I think it was on one of the islands that he was actually reconning. But his plan, Operational Plan 712, was included later on in War Plan Orange. And it was almost exactly what we did in World War II. We followed his plan, and it was very accurate. In fact, this document, this is a field manual for the Marines. It was still in use in 2000, right? So his plan is still good today. I mean, that was the level of ability that he had to be able to figure this out, and then the strategy, the tactics. How do we do that? Because we had never really used invading islands, right? It was all new to us. How do you take an island, right, in the middle of Pacific? So he's figuring this out, and he went on those islands that Japan owned, and then figured out how to do that, how to do the invasion. And then the other part of this document that's interesting. So this is the field manual update from the 1990s, but it's basically his. But there's a forward here, and this is interesting to give you the context about what was some of the mindset in those days. This is Brigadier General Zinni. He's a Marine commanding general for the Combat Development Command, and he writes the forward to this, talking about Major Ellis. But he says, that there's a very racist tone. So the general himself knows there's a very racist tone that's undeniable. It is regrettable. It accurately reflects the sentiments of a substantial, if not predominant, segment of American society in the early 20th century. These racist views had very tragic consequences. They helped precipitate the diplomatic climate which contributed to the outbreak of war in the Pacific. Further, a belief in an innate racial superiority made military strength seem less critical from a national perspective, and that fostered a lack of preparedness for war against Japan. I disagree with him on that, but he thinks it could be more. That belief also caused many Americans in and out of uniform to experience a rude shock when the U.S. forces encountered firsthand the genuine fighting abilities of the Japanese armed forces. In short, it must be realized today that these racist attitudes helped to cause the war, as well as probably to raise the number of American casualties in the early months of the Pacific War. And again, that's, the Brigadier General for the U.S. Marines writing in 1992. So he accurately, honestly looks at the past and does it. Now, what is he talking about? So one of the interesting parts was when he says we underestimate the enemy. That was true because you can actually read in his Major Ellis's point that he says that the Japanese aren't going to be able to fight very well because the Americans are much stronger, much better, and the Japanese will give up too quickly. So, which didn't happen at all, right? So that was underestimating the enemy, and so that was kind of his downfall. And so a lot of Americans, like a lot of British, thought that the Japanese weren't going to be as tough as they were, and so that in that way they weren't mentally prepared. They underestimated their enemy. They thought, oh, this is going to be easy, but it wasn't. There's Major Ellis, and then this is the Brigadier General here in the introduction to this in 1990s, but it was written originally in 1921, and then everything that he did. So it was quite interesting. And then the quote from the racist views was written by the general, the Marine general, and then, working in there. But again, it was technically, he was very, very good at going on the islands and understanding strategically and tactically what we needed to take those islands. But again, we were preparing for island hopping as early as 1920s and working it into the major War Plan Orange. So, that was already there. So just kind of let people know that level of preparedness and training for that. And then you were able to see this as well?
I am seeing now advanced base operations in Micronesia.
Okay, good. So you saw that. And then let's see. There we go. So just want to make sure you were able to see that. So thank you for letting me know.
Now I see you.
Good.
Okay.
Okay. I'm almost afraid to do any more tabs there, so we'll see.
It's very interesting. So the more you research, the more you found that the deep preparation that America had since 1907, despite in the history, like conventional awareness, everybody think that Japan started the war by sneak attacking Pearl Harbor, but actually this idea came from the book The Great Pacific War, written by British, which one of Japanese general read. And
Admiral Yamamoto, yeah.
Yamamoto Isoroku. It's interesting. So America had well prepared before war, and it kinetic war actually started. Mm-hmm. But now, if we are to look at the situation, if CCP is to attack United States, then the war may begin. But America is not prepared.
No, and I looked pretty much after the war, there were on a lot of things we haven't done any full scale exercises, right? So remember, this was 20 years of preparing for war against a nation that was 1/10 our size. Japan was tiny, right? And when we started preparing for war, Japan didn't have Manchuria, right? It didn't have all this territory with resources they can kind of pull in there. They were still just basically what's Formosa, Korea, and Japan. That was it. And we were preparing this much for a country that's 1/10 our size, right? China is huge, right? China has a far greater population than we have. They have a large landmass, their internal lines of communication, they have resources, and they produce most of our equipment, right? So China, a lot of things that we need are made there. So it's a much greater threat than Japan was. The other difference between Japan and China is that Japan didn't want to conquer the world, right? It didn't believe that it was, going to conquer the world. It basically wanted Asia for Asians. I mean, some groups did. Other groups were just like, we just need, we need the ability to have resources that come in. Otherwise, we're going to starve to death in the modern world. They recognize that, especially after World War I, they need resources, right? The American Army planners knew in 1911, what would America do if America was Japan? We'd take Manchuria. We knew that in 1911. That's exactly what we would do. If I was Japan, I'd take Manchuria because we need to, right? And Japan waited until 1931 to do that. After the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria in 1929, right, coming to the border and then pulling out and seeding it with more revolutionaries. People leave that out. But Japan, didn't have this aggressive ability. We also found details of Prime Minister Konoe at the time trying to talk to Roosevelt. He wanted a conference with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Initially in Hawaii, Roosevelt said, Hawaii's too far, I'm not going to go there. They said, fine, Konoe, I'll meet you in Alaska, right? I'll meet you, FDR, in Alaska. And FDR ignored him, right? So, Japan was not like China. China is very aggressive. China does want to dominate the world. They believe they're going to dominate the world. They are very, very aggressive, and they have strengths and advantages that far exceed what Japan had in, even 1940, right? Even after Japan, took some of Southeast Asia, they didn't have this kind of resources. They hadn't developed Manchuria yet, right? Manchukuo. They had not been able to do those sorts of things. They were bankrupt almost by 1939, 1940. Which brings me to another point. There was actually a serious economic warfare. Let me find that real quick here, against Japan, that we've not done against China. We're feeding China. This is the other crazy part. So not only are we not training to go any type of confrontation with China on the level that we did with Japan, even though China's bigger, we're not. With Japan, we economically blockaded them before the war, and that was a big deal. And it wasn't just because of China; it was part of the plan from the beginning. Remember, I showed you in 1908. We've already looked at Japan and the economics, and we know they're vulnerable. And it's an island nation; they're vulnerable. We're going to blockade them. This is an excellent book. Another one. There's a lot of books. I'll probably show you a few more. Edward Miller, he wrote this a few years ago, but it goes into the economic warfare that the United States did against Japan, the goal being to bankrupt it. So it wasn't just the oil. It wasn't just scrap metal. It was funds. It was gold. It was the ability to be able to exchange money to buy up from other countries. We were kind of stopping the financial maneuvers of Japan to prevent you bankrupting it. So you couldn't buy from Holland. You couldn't buy oil from the Netherlands. You couldn't buy, materials and goods and services and that sort of thing. And so that was the thing that we were doing with Japan before the war started, right? We're going to economically wear you down so that you don't have enough money to train, to equip, to buy allies and friends. You're going to be broke and you're going to be borrowing money. That was a big deal in Thailand. In 1941 and 1942, the Japanese actually were asking Thailand for loans. And Thailand's like, we're a poor country. What are you doing? Why do you need a loan? Whereas America could come in and, hey, we're paying. So that, a lot of people wanted to be our friend because we had money and we're passing money around. Japan comes in, has no money. It's really hard to make friends, right? It's hard to keep countries and people to support you when you have no money and you're going to them going, can you feed me? And so compare that with China now. We're feeding China. So we're not bankrupting China. In some cases, we're bankrupting our allies to feed China, So again, that's very disturbing, to say the least. In that, that's another problem. The other thing is that, rightly or wrongly, America was focused, as you saw, with, letting everyone know about, hey, Japan's an enemy, Japan's this and that, right? So we had a war scare in 1907, 1913. We had, these kind of propaganda books. There's a bunch of newspaper articles. If you go to the website, click on those links, newspaper articles all throughout, talking about discussing the war, a war with Japan, a future war with Japan, and what that means, both pro and against. But we don't have that kind of realistic talk about China, what China does. And so, that's another disturbing part is people don't understand the reality of the CCP's control of Asia, right? What we call China is a lot of occupied territory by, what's now kind of a CCP empire, right? A red empire, like the Ottoman Empire or, Austria-Hungary or something like that. We're not talking about it. We're not discussing these things. In fact, a lot of Americans don't understand what happened to Falun Gong, Falun Darfa, the Uyghurs, designs on Okinawa. I mean, the Chinese are very aggressive. The CCP is very aggressive in Okinawa. They're down in the Philippines. They're attacking Philippine fishermen, right, to deny them their own islands. They're very aggressive. Admiral Harry Harris talked about the Great Wall of Sand that they're building up. This was 10 years ago. Most Americans don't know that. That's not out there in the public eye. I have not found a good book that's similar to Hector Bywater about what's a war with China going to look like, right? Definitely nobody in the command general staff colleges are reading any book like that. It's just not there, right? So we talk about maybe economic competition. We talk about, they're stealing our stuff, but nobody's ever talked about a kinetic war, the potential for kinetic war with the CCP, which is a very real possibility. And so mentally we're not prepared. We haven't really gamed it. We haven't planned it. We haven't trained on it. And there may be a plan out there, but if you don't train on a plan, it's worthless, right? It's just fantasy. You've got to train on a plan, and you got to train on a plan again and again and again and fail. I mean, I want to train till I fail and then do it again and then do it again and then do it again and then fail and fail and fail. Why? Because when I go to combat, I don't want to fail, right? I want to know every way I can fail and prevent that when I actually go down range and begin operations. So that's kind of what the fear is with how our policy is now with China. And so for Japan, and a lot of Americans I'll talk to, and they have this view that we were just sleeping. I mean, that's how this project started, right? In other words, how did we suddenly rebound from Pearl Harbor? We didn't. We were ready for 20 years by the time Pearl Harbor hit. We knew they were going to hit Pearl Harbor. I mean, we fired an Admiral Richardson, the first admiral of Pearl Harbor. We didn't move our ships to Pearl Harbor until 1940. Here's a fun fact for you. So our ships had been stationed in San Diego, safe in San Diego, right? So if the Japanese wanted to do a surprise attack, you got to go past Hawaii all the way to San Diego to get our ships. No way. And what happened was after the fleet problems in 1940. Now remember, we had practiced in 1938. We did a big fleet exercise, and we had actually attacked Pearl Harbor in 1938 training. So we'd actually launched a training attack against Pearl Harbor. One of our admirals did that, and surprise attack Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Pearl Harbor. 1938 during the big fleet exercise. So we know it's vulnerable, right? Everybody knows it's vulnerable. So in 1940 fleet exercises, they're planned, but they didn't go back to San Diego. They stayed at Pearl Harbor, knowing it's vulnerable, knowing that you can do a sneak attack. You're moving forward. Come get me, right? And Admiral Richardson was in charge at the time, and he's like, this is stupid. We're going to get attacked. We know we're going to get attacked, right? Now we know why he was so upset, because we'd actually game played it, right? We realize it's vulnerable. So Admiral Richardson actually talks to FDR, and he says, this is stupid. This is dumb. I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, we shouldn't be here in Hawaii. This is dumb. And FDR goes, you're probably right, but you're fired. And then he puts another admiral in there that's kind of a yes man, right? So, what was FDR thinking? Either he's stupid, and he's not. FDR's a Navy man. He knows the Navy. He reads the War Plan Orange. He does interjections into the war planning process. So FDR was kind of a warlord in that he was very involved in some aspects of what their assumptions were and how they're going to conduct it. And he observed some of the fleet problems. So he was there. He saw how this went. So there's a lot of questions about, what was he doing exactly? Was he putting them out there as bait? Possibly, but they're there and they were vulnerable, and we know subject to sneak attack, but we didn't move there till 1940. We didn't base the fleet there till 1940. So there it is. A lot of problems. We knew, for example, the Philippines was going to get wiped out. As early as 1910, the Navy's like, there's no way. If we go to war with Japan, the Philippines is gone, right? Everybody in the Philippines, Japan can take the Philippines, and it's going to take us maybe 2 years to finally get there and start fighting back in the Philippines at a minimum. And the Navy knew this. And this is before the island hopping campaign. This is just steaming right over there, right? Because now we're in your turf. So they wouldn't do it. But the Army, there were some Army generals. One was General Leonard Wood, basically said, we can't leave the Philippines because this is the outpost of Christianity. Our honor demands that we stay in the Philippines. And so that's why we stayed in the Philippines. That's why MacArthur was in the Philippines. Everybody knew you're not going to survive it. You're not going to make it. Japan will take it. Nobody can rescue you. Impossible. And we'd known that for 30 years. And yet we put soldiers in 1940. We mobilized the reserves. So all of the reserves, there's about 1.4 million soldiers were mobilized from the reserve and the National Guard in 1940. They were mobilized and they went to big training exercises, Louisiana maneuvers, big training. That's when the Army was really getting ready now, right? Now the Army's getting spun up. Navy had been training since the 20s. The Army's now getting ready to go. And we sent reserve officers who had just mobilized from America in 1940. And in 1941, we mobilized some more and we just threw them in the Philippines, knowing that they're going to get captured. There's no hope for rescue. And yet the U.S. government put them in harm's way, knowing you're going to get captured. There's no way we can come rescue you. That's, to me, that's criminal, right? It's like, why even do that? So there's a lot of things that when you read this as an American, you get upset, you get disturbed, and that sort of thing. And then, but, they were planning and training, and we're just not doing that against China, and what now if China attacks Taiwan, they'll attack probably Okinawa same time. And then with cyber attacks, there'll be, all sorts of things that go on, in a much larger scale than the Japanese could, and we're not training. So Japan needs to look at this honestly and realize we weren't surprise attacked and then came back. We had been planning, waiting, and that was how we fought World War II, right? We had trained, we had planned, we had equipped, we had projected everything. We knew the timetables, we knew the geography. We were really, really ready for this thing, right? Now, we like to promote it. Oh, I'm just walking along, I got hit, and then I was able to suddenly beat them, right? Because that's a good myth. I don't, you kind of project, this is my story, right? I was an underdog. No, but the danger is we believe it ourselves now, right? And so we think if China attacks us, we can suddenly mobilize and go back. I'm not confident on that, right? We need to be ready for it, and we're not. So Japan needs to recognize we're not ready. You guys got to be ready, right? Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, all the Southeast Asian, the ASEAN nations need to recognize, how is that going to work? And if our strategic interests are elsewhere, how much can we extend to protect Japan? Is that even in a plan? If we get hit multiple sides, right? So remember, China is aligned in the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, with Iran and Russia, right? And a whole host of other nations now are joining the SCO. And it's a defense and security and economic and intelligence sharing organization, kind of like the evil NATO. But if that starts to happen, if the Middle East oil is now threatened by Iran that moves down, if Russia begins to attack Poland, right? So they wipe out Ukraine, they start to move into Poland, what happens now, right? Or they threaten nuclear war. The U.S. is going to have to, do we have the capacity anymore to fight these multiple front wars? And can we even if we wanted to, could we be able to defend Japan? I don't know. But it doesn't look like we would be able to from the people that I've talked to on that operational level. The resources, we can only pick one theater to fight in and work it that way. And that's kind of frightening. And so Japan needs to recognize, what we've been saying for a long time is that, Japan needs to, in my opinion, and this is just opinion, is, Article 9 needs to go away and you need to be able to defend yourself. And, you may have to extend help to others, because if Taiwan goes, there's TSMC there, the silicon chip maker, and a lot of silicon chips that you depend on for everything right now. That's going to go away, right? That's in CCP control, or it's destroyed, and who's going to repair it?
You mean that chip, like IC chip? Oh, do you know, like this year, if you were to go on a train, you have a card, IC card, you can just touch and then go. But because there are not enough supply, the rail company stopped selling this new card. Originally, there were two types. One was for without any ID. So it's not connected to any credit card or no name on it, which is what I have. The other one is if you lose it, you can get it back because it's connected to your, you have an account So,
Uh,
but then they stopped selling both. So
because they couldn't get the supplies in of the silicon chips.
that's what they say.
Interesting. Yeah.
But so
Well,
yes.
I know. Yeah, there's a lot of supply chain issues. I know some car manufacturers had to stop making some models because they couldn't get the supply in, and we're not even at war yet. So if the foundry in Taiwan, which is where most of the silicon chips are made, if that goes away, that's huge. And so what's going to happen if it's destroyed in a war or if it's captured? Either way, how are we going to be able to maintain it? And that should be a huge priority. And I don't see any plans or anything, any training. We've not trained the Taiwanese military to any big degree. We've not trained on that integration with Taiwan. In fact, we're not even recognizing Taiwan as an independent nation sometimes. So, I mean, how are we?
I have a question. I have a question. So when you researched about this, so there are a whole bunch of military personnel who actually participated in this exercise. And there are a person who wrote this book, The Great Pacific War, which was best-selling book. So at that time, people kind of like had an idea that America and Japan will go to war. Like, was there anybody who had this holistic view of what's happening and trying to warn American people? Like, this is not sneak attack. Like, has been planned for a long time, so we should realize what is happening. Like people who are trying to wake up people. Were there such person? Because if we can identify those people, then we can learn from them that like things that we have to do now. Because there are so many news and so many like CCP did this and Japanese infiltrated politician did this, said this, like we paid a lot of money, so many things happening. And I'm sorry. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, I put it in a mana mode, but it rang. So what I was trying to say is that we cannot look one incident to understand just by itself. Like we have to know, because sometimes there are news that seems contradicting, but actually it is something that seems contradicting. Both are on scenario or narrative. Like you mentioned, there was one military man who went to all the islands that America were going to take, and they were thinking, instead of third country will take this island, it's better for Japan to take it, then America can just take it. It's controversial, contradicting, but that's the situation that they needed. So I think that kind of view is what we need. Otherwise, we will be emotionally driven by the media and we just get divided and conquer when we have to understand and come together to stop this. So what I was going to say is that, were there such a person who was warning people at that time, and who would you recommend to pay attention to nowadays?
Well, for nowadays, at that time, there were people that were talking about it's not a good idea, right? So Hector Bywater was trying to say this war is going to be bloody and all that sort of thing. We shouldn't do it. And then, warning people about this. There were people that Admiral Richardson, he said, hey, if we move the fleet to Pearl Harbor, we're going to get attacked. It's just the way it is. Ambassador Grew in Japan was warning. He says, if we put this pressure on Japan, they're going to attack, right? So people were aware of it and they were trying to warn it. But in that case, there was a large group in America and Russia, the Soviet Union, that wanted America and Japan to go to war, right? So we had planned for it, we trained, and then they were politically pushing for it at that moment. And there was a lot going on. And so the conditions were set, and that inertia took it. For today, and you're absolutely right about emotional thinking will divide you and mess you up. That's why we do evidence-based approach. Part of that is We actually do a course on how to think like a detective, and you have to go to suppress your emotional thinking and enhance your rational thinking, right? Just kind of look at it objectively as much as you can. And that's helpful. So who is now not so emotional based thinker in this? There's a few people that are good on looking at China. But it's such a huge problem. So it gets kind of mixed up. So there's the domestic side. So China is very, very, we're already at war with China, basically, an asymmetric war, because they're already infiltrating, doing agents of influence. They're already doing small level sabotage. They've been doing industrial theft, the spying that's going on. So, this has already been going on. It's been going on since the 90s effectively, right? So it's just increased. So for domestic stuff on the American side, guys like Bill Gertz, because he shows how there was Katrina Lung, who was her call sign was Parlor Maid. She was a Chinese spy, a Chinese agent of influence. She actually got into the FBI. It was the worst intelligence failure in American history, and hardly anybody knows about it, right? And she was able to manipulate the FBI even to get executive level briefings to the president, right? About, don't worry about China, it's no problem, right? So she was able to influence that. He talks about the Hollywood influence, how movies are changed to kowtow to the Chinese and all that. So Bill Gertz is pretty good on that to look at. I would recommend him. For the kind of the military side, I don't know if anybody has really game played it, and I don't know who it would be. I know Admiral Harry Harris early on was looking at the threats and that sort of thing. So he's pretty good on the kinetic side, like, what's a naval war going to look like between America and China, and how do we have to look at, if China moves forward into this, now they're vulnerable and we can get them, that kind of level of operational thinking and strategic thinking. I'm not 100% sure that we have that kind of thinker like Bywater, right? That's actually looking at capabilities and going in there. And again, that's another frightening thing that I don't know on the kinetic side. On the informational war side, a lot of guys, Michael Yon, folks like that can go in there. Bill Gertz is pretty good. The one that you've interviewed a few of them, I think, on your channel. So the Marine that was down in Okinawa. So he's very good about, informational operations in Japan, these covert operations with China and Japan. So he does very good on that. So there's a few about
Eldridge.
Eldridge, yep, Dr. Eldridge. Yeah, so he's good. But they're not, from what I've seen, and there may be something I haven't seen. I haven't seen anything about a big kinetic war, right? Like here's a major war, like, China starts to move into Taiwan. Now what do we do, right? Which carrier group is going to get mobilized? What happens with the fleet? Are the Japanese involved in that? Which carriers are going? Which Japanese assets are going where, and what's that look like? Chinese attacking, in Okinawa. The fifth column, which is basically, the Chinese assets that are already in Japan are going to activate, right? And they're going to be able to do that. There is a good book on that for United Front. It's called Kwai Wu. It's actually down in my library, but it talks about how China manipulates overseas Chinese to go communist, to become CCP assets, and then wait. So that it's a much more complex than it was in World War II. So where it's primarily a naval battle. But there's so many things I don't know. That's a good question, though. I'll look around, but I haven't seen a rational thinker that's talking about the big war with us in China. I haven't seen it, but I'd be interested if there's a Japanese writer that's looked into that. That's very good. I'd be very interested in if you find somebody like that. I'd be very interested in reading if it's in English.
Oh yes, but it's
Good
very
question.
interesting.
That made me think. That's a good question.
But you already gave us a lot of the names that we can check and we can listen to. So it's very helpful. Thank you very much. And that's why we have to try out your historical detective agency course.
Yeah.
Lastly, could you introduce us what this historical detective agency offers? Because your explanation is very interesting, because we have to protect ourselves from rape of the mind, and we have to know the mechanism. And with that knowledge, we need to look at the history or current news, and that's what you teach in this project, correct?
Yep. It's very true. Yeah. So we call it evidence-based approach. And again, it's just taking a private investigator or detective mindset, right? So an investigatory mindset. And what you have to do is you have to recognize a few things. You have to know your mind, right? And you have to know realistically your mind, your biases, your weaknesses, and adjust them so that you can be able to look at evidence correctly, assess it, and then process it, right? And then you have to understand other people's minds and that sort of thing. So what we've developed is Think Like a Detective 101. It's a prototype course. So if you have, it's in English right now. If there's enough Japanese, we might look at maybe trying to translate it into Japanese or other languages. It's a prototype course now, but the first module you can go through, it's free for the first module. And what it does is it kind of baselines your mind. Like you said, the rape of the mind. There's all kind of tricks out there that manipulate you and how do you think. And so what we do is we teach you, number one, how to identify your own biases, right? Because we all have biases, right? You're Japanese. You're going to look at things as a Japanese. It's just how you are. You're going to look at things as a Japanese based on your history, how you grew up, and events around you, your emotion at the moment. Are you tired? Are you healthy? All these biases are actually working in manipulating how you view the world. And so you have to identify them and then reduce them. You can never eliminate them, but you can reduce them. And then the other thing is once you've kind of done that, for the historical side, you have to understand a couple of things. And one is, for example, memory, right? In other words, when I'm reading these books on history, a lot of the academic-based approach, especially nowadays, and this is the frightening part for me as an investigator, is in the investigation side, everyone knows. So police investigators, private investigators, you name it, understand that memory is the worst form of evidence. The worst, right? Absolutely. If you have one person, one witness, okay. If I have a CCTV camera, great. If I've got documents, I have a key card access. It went. Okay, good. I've got forensics evidence. That's great. If it's one person coming up with nothing substantiating it, and he has his testimony, if that's all I've got, okay. But I have to be very careful about it because human memory is very, very what we call malleable, very changeable. The moment, and because it comes down to this, most people think that when you see something, when you experience something, and it goes into memory, they think it's like being written in stone, right? It's there written in stone, it's recorded and fixed. And it's just, I have problems figuring out where it is, right? I have to go back and try to look, but it's there somewhere. I have this perfect memory and I just have to go back and remember it. And that's not true. There was a great research by Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. She has a fantastic series of books and she writes about memory, right? The myth of memory. And through her, and she's done great stuff with the FBI, Department of Justice, court cases, real world court cases about false memory. The moment you see something, every single moment from the moment you see it and experience it, it's being rewritten. You're re-remembering it. You're re-remembering it. It's being torn down, built up, and rebuilt every single time. It's not written down. It's like you draw a picture, throw it away, draw a picture, throw it away, draw a picture, throw it away. You're trying to recreate that picture. That's what your mind does. And it's very, very open to influence. So for example, if I see a car wreck, right? And then that night I go watch a movie about a car wreck, those will blend, right? And I will think elements from that movie I saw, and I swear I saw it. And you'll remember it that way because it's rebuilt in there, right? Those images of that car wreck were similar enough to the car wreck you saw. The movie is similar enough to the car wreck you saw that you'll blend those two together and then keep reforming it. And it gets worse over time. So you have to realize, that's very, very what we call malleable. And the problem is that historians, an academic-based approach nowadays, will say, well, this person said it, so it must be true. It's like, no, it isn't. Without substantiating documentation, he may believe it, right? So the person may not be lying, but they're not telling the truth. They're not saying facts. That's how they remember it, but that does not represent what actually happened, right? If you look at a videotape versus what somebody said, it's completely different, right? And so you have to recognize that when you're studying history, just because somebody says it, it may not have happened. It may be completely opposite. And then we look at other things. So for example, a witness, are they qualified to talk about what they see? And this is another problem. So, for example, if you're reading a book and they're talking about a battle, and a civilian who's 12 years old or 5 years old comes on a battlefield and he says, I saw 100,000 dead people on that battlefield. Well, a couple problems. One is, how do you count 100,000 people, right? Most human beings, if they see something, if you look out, count the grass. I don't know, count the trees, right? Count cars in a parking lot. Unless you're like 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you're just driving through, how many are there? I don't know. And you make guesses that are usually wrong. So are you qualified to be able to do that? Can you physically know how many people are there? 100,000 dead. How do you know? Right? How do you count that? And the other thing is, how does a 5-year-old or a 12-year-old understand what like combat is, right? So you'll have a guy that was 12 years old. He's in the battle. He walks into a battle or a war, comes to his village, and he talks about it. Well, he's emotional about it, but he doesn't have the ability to describe what he's seeing, right? So a non-doctor talking about surgery, right? I walked into an operating room. I'm not a surgeon. Look at what this guy's doing. He's cutting open somebody. Oh, that's horrible. What is he doing, right? Well, he's a surgeon. He knows what he's doing, right? He's saving that guy's life. But if you don't know what you're doing, if you're not a surgeon, you've never seen a surgeon, you don't understand it, and you walk in there, it just looks like somebody cutting somebody up on a table, right? That's how a child would see an operating room. They're butchering that human being. That's horrible. It's frightening. And the emotion would be there, and then it would exacerbate the memory. So you have to take in that account. Memory is going to change. And if you see a movie or read a book about that event, it's going to change your memory, and you'll really think you saw it, but you never saw it. It never actually happened. You remember it that way. You're not lying, but you're not right. And then were you qualified to say it? And the other thing is Gestalt theory. If I can't understand things, if there's a gap in what I see and what I understand, my brain wants to fill in that gap. That's what it does, right? And so that these elements we look at, but instead of investigating a murder or a missing person or some other type of fraud or that sort of thing, we're investigating history using the skills of a detective and understanding human nature, our own nature, other people's nature, and how you evaluate and look at evidence, and then you investigate history. And that prevents rape of the mind, or a little bit helps with rape of the mind, because you become a rational thinker versus an emotional thinker. So for me, as an American, reading the subject, emotionally, it's very hard, right? Because, my grandfather was in World War II. He was a Navy, corpsman, he was a corpsman for a little while. Then he was a chief pharmacist mate, served on a destroyer, USS Hall. And, you see this, and we have this myth in America. We were innocently sleeping, we got hit, and then we fought back. And then the evidence is not there. So emotionally, it kind of goes, well, we're just like everybody else, right? We're like every other nation. We're gonna fight in our own interests and do things. So emotionally, it's hard. But is this the facts? Yes. Is this what happened to the best of the evidence? Yes. Does it hurt emotionally? Yes. Will I tell the truth? Yes. Right. We just collect the evidence and we present the evidence. We try to suspend judgment. This is the evidence. This is what it supports. And so that's kind of what that course does. It's online. And if you go through it, like I said, it's free. It is a work in progress. So we would love feedback. If there's a better way to explain it, for the Japanese audience, if enough people are there, we can modify it and make it a little easier, for the Japanese and how to do things. So I'm a detective, not a video person. You've got the amazing production values. I'm, I don't have those kind of things, but the subject matter, I'm very passionate about it. And I think more people need that skill set so they can look at history and take the right lessons so we can find the right solutions and make this the future a little bit better.
Yes, very interesting. I want to ask you more questions, but maybe if we got a chance, maybe I would like to do more interview about this, like on a different occasion. Because, for example, you talked about memory, and like if we see a car accident and if we see a movie about car accident, the memory mixed up. I was wondering, like, if like Hollywood would do this like intentionally, because it's very interesting. Like we see this Hollywood movie and then like, oh, similar thing happened. Like what? And like the order of this is what I'm very interested. Like they show us and it happened, or it happened and show us, or like TV drama plays and then suddenly similar thing happens. Like how our minds are manipulated in this real world. It's very interesting topic. So everyone, if you are interested in this course, please visit Historical Detective Agency. I will put this link so that people can go to the website. Okay, so thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and lecture. Could you please give us one last message to the audience?
Ooh, just that, again, looking at history is very important because it is the future, right? And so you're never locked into your past, right? There's always a chance to do better. There's always a chance to learn and make things better. And so, it seems kind of bleak, the way we talk about this. It seems kind of depressing, but the past has happened. That's over with, right? So it's what we do today in the future that matters. And so I would tell everyone, learn from it. Don't get emotional about it, even though maybe it's frustrating or upsetting. But take those lessons and use it for good in the future, and we can avoid some of the pitfalls we saw in the past. And keep looking for truth. Keep searching, keep looking for the truth, and in that find those good solutions. And then working together, we get a lot done, I think. So that would be my only advice and my last word. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Yes, we are living in eternal now. That's what I like recently I read. Thank you so much. And everybody, thank you very much for watching. And I hope you will spread this interview. Okay, now let me stop recording.